So, Renato, does the decision out of the Southern District of Texas mean that Donald Trump's administration can't deport people anymore under the Alien Enemies Act?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Mimi Roca, a former federal prosecutor and a former district attorney and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skeet. So Asha is not here this week. She is off, and Mimi has graciously decided to come in. This is very exciting for me. I have not done a podcast with you in years before your election as district attorney, so we're glad to have you back.
Thank you. It's great to be back with you. Yes, during Trump 1, I think we did quite a few together, but this is our first time around in Trump 2.
Yes.
So there's even more to talk about.
No kidding. And this is a great week to have you on because we actually have some good news, which is rare as of late. I actually think a positive decision out of the Southern District of Texas, and something I didn't really have on my bingo card, which is you had a Trump appointed judge not only issue a decision against the administration, but to do so on a class-wide basis. And if I recall correctly, and basically go on a broader theory than he had to in order to reach the decision, I think.
So, yes, this judge in the Southern District of Texas, where at least 3 petitioners just means, the people who are asking the court for relief through the American Civil Liberties Union brought what's called a habeas petition, basically because they're in custody in Texas. They're saying, we need the courts to step in. And what we need the courts to do is to rule on whether our due process rights are being violated. And we think they're being violated because we don't think the president can invoke the Alien Enemies Act, the AEA, which people are probably somewhat familiar with at this time, to deport us from the country, because the AEA is a wartime powers act, essentially, that the president can invoke in very limited circumstances, and has only been used 3 times, I think, before in actual wars, where there were wars declared in this country, World War I and I think World War II. And that here's, the theory that the government is using of these people they want to deport are members of a Venezuela gang called TDA, Tren de Aragua. That is not a factual basis to satisfy the statute, basically. That's what the petitioners are saying. I mean, they have other arguments, but that's the one that the court essentially ends up ruling on. And they say, there's no war here. There's no invasion. There's no incursion. I mean, even if you accept, which the court does for purposes of its decision, that TDA is run by the Venezuela government, so it ever could be sort of a wartime invader. The government Trump has not shown that here yet.
Yes. And by the way, it's a very important point because really, first of all, this is a really remarkable decision by Judge Fernando Rodriguez Jr., who was appointed by Donald Trump and is not like somebody who is some sort of compromise choice. He is, I would say, fair to say, a Texas conservative judge who basically said, when interpreting the the Alien Enemies Act, that has to the president has to point to a military incursion by armed forces. It cannot merely be that there's some sort of organization that he's calling an enemy. And that's so important because one of the nightmare scenarios that Asha and I have been discussing for weeks has been, um, the administration or Trump saying, "Hey, we think Democratic Socialists of America are an enemy of the state," or MSNBC, or the Contrarian, or whatever. And basically, what I think the judge is rightfully doing is saying this is a statute that gives the president very broad powers, and instead of just finding, because what the judge could have done maybe is, I think, could have said, look, I don't need to reach that issue because they haven't, maybe there's a due process right they have or something else. The judge didn't do that. He went to this, I'd say, very fundamental issue and issued a ruling that doesn't just apply to the individuals in this case, but applies to a class of people in the Southern District of Texas that can include some other cases.
Right. So, I mean, one answer to our complicated question, though, is part of why it's complicated is, on the one hand, this applies to anyone that they would try to make this this allegation about in the Southern District of Texas, but it doesn't apply beyond that, right? So the question of, does it mean that the administration can't deport people or remove people under the AEA? Well, in the rest of the country, this does not yet impact that, right? It's only in Texas. So that's an important sort of limitation.
Correct.
And then, yeah, I mean, the judge, I think already we're seeing, and you and I have already been part of some discussions where legal commentators are debating, like, did the judge go too far? Was this a legal holding or a factual holding? I mean, he kind of does a combination of both, right? And it's almost, I mean, if the key holding, which is on page 19 of the opinion, the judge says the president cannot summarily declare that a foreign nation or government has threatened or perpetrated an invasion or predatory incursion of the United States, followed by the identification of the alien enemies subject to detention or removal, right? So basically saying, you can't just say this, you have to have evidence. Well, he's saying you have to at least allege more evidence. He at other points seems to not say they have to prove it factually, which is problematic, because what's to stop them now from just going back and alleging it, right? And so there is an opening there for them to sort of slip into now and just go back and say, oh yeah, well, here's why we thought it, as opposed to just saying the conclusion. Whether that, I mean, it seems like under this judge's standard, that might be enough, which is scary because this administration will say anything, right? And the reason they've been losing in courts, not just here, but in multiple places, is because out there in the real world and the press and the media, they can say whatever they want and they rarely get challenged on it. And it becomes sort of a fact because they say it. But in a court, judges are requiring more than just the say so. So I'm a little nervous about how this plays out now.
I think that's right. Now, basically what he says is essentially that while the president doesn't have to reveal his sources or get into too many details, he at least needs to identify sufficient information to permit judicial review of whether a foreign nation or government's conduct constitutes an actual attempted or threatened invasion or predatory incursion of the United States. But based upon how he defined it in his opinion, he's really talking about an armed incursion. So he would basically there needs to be some showing that there's sort of good reason to believe, perhaps, that nation X or government X is trying to infiltrate the United States with armed forces. That's still a significant limiter, but you're right, I suppose. Trump could say, well, the Democratic Party is doing that, but it's just, I think it's hard. It's not a foreign government. It's certainly not, it's very hard for him to argue that that's a armed incursion. I think it does provide a substantial limitation.
No question. And so, we should emphasize, when this came down, I think the initial reaction was, wow, this is just a total repudiation of this AEA theory that the Trump administration, because it's one of the first rulings on the merits, right? All these other rulings in other courts and the Supreme Court, the 1 a.m. decision that everybody was, rightfully made a big deal about, all of that was about notice and forums and, kind of process. This is one of, I think, the first on the merits of, can you use the AEA now in this way? And it overall is, I would much rather have it this way. It's just the court went a little farther than it needed to, I think, because it could have just said, you didn't even attempt to describe something that would fit the statute, but instead it said you didn't, and here's how you would do that. You would have to, provide not all your state secrets, but some of them. He also did another good part of this is, he rejected the theory that everything about this is a political question that the courts can't review, which in ordinary times, I think we would have not even thought was possible that he would have ruled the other way, but we get nervous about that stuff now. So that's another good point of it.
That's right. I think what a lot of our listeners and viewers are concerned about is courts, when Trump does something that's very heinous, like rounding up people and just shipping them to a prison in El Salvador, a court saying, oh, well, we can't really take a look at that. We can't do anything about it. We're powerless. And we're going to punt the question, sidestep the question in some way. And here you have a judge who didn't do that. And in fact, part of, I want to make sure our listeners understand that part of what you're saying, Mimi, is, judges usually do the minimal amount of things necessary to reach a decision. They're usually not trying to answer questions that don't absolutely need to be answered. Here you had a judge, I think, going out of his way to answer some of these questions and doing it in a way to make sure, in other words, to ensure that there's judicial review, to ensure that judges can review this because of what's at stake. Sweeping power, as he, I think, indicates in the opinion for the executive branch, that needs to be carefully exercised in accordance with the Constitution.
Right. There is a judicial doctrine basically about not going beyond the narrowest question that you need to answer or decide a case. It seems like this judge went a little bit farther. Not irrationally so, but a little bit farther, in part because while he was ruling in a way that was not good for the administration, he also seemed to be saying, but don't worry, I'm not saying that this is going to be some intense factual inquiry, because that would have had quite a blowback then. Not that they're not going to criticize the opinion or the decision, but that would have brought up even more critique.
Well, I think there he'd have a greater chance of reversal. As you mentioned, Mimi, this is the Southern District of Texas, so it's not even all of Texas. This is a piece of Texas. It's Houston. I think San Antonio is part of the Southern District of Texas as well. So it's a southern part of Texas. And basically, this is where the administration might want to handle a lot of deportations from, because the Court of Appeals, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where I clerked many years ago, is now one of the most conservative Court of Appeals in the country. So this would be a good forum for there to do that. And essentially what the judge is trying to do, Judge Rodriguez, is saying, look, Fifth Circuit, I'm not saying anything crazy here. I'm just basically, right. I'm not trying to say that, the administration has to put a bunch of classified information out there. What I'm trying to say is they need to at least provide enough so that judges can review this. So I think it's a very significant opinion. And it's also worth knowing, we talked in the front end, Mimi, about how you were on my podcast. This was my prior podcast on topic before I brought Asha on. And I also had Lee Gillard on that podcast, who was the lawyer in this case. So this was the ACLU. And he, at the time I had him on my podcast because he was representing the kids in cages, literally. And here they are now in this case. And I think it just goes to show the important work that a lot of nonprofits are doing and making a difference. When people want to know, how can you make a difference? I think this is an example of a case in which there's an organization really making a difference.
Absolutely. The ACLU has been, out front or working in partnership on so many cases. And, you know, I think my brother actually works for the ACLU and has for his entire legal career. And, you know, just through observation and through talking to him, you know, I think sometimes the ACLU gets kind of taken for granted, right? When things are good and we don't feel nervous or anxious about our rights, you know, donations go down and people just don't focus and appreciate. And in times like this, you know, you really, if you care about democracy and due process and our rights and not having ordinary people just picked up off the street, then you're saying, thank goodness for the ACLU and other groups like it.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of times the ACLU will be in the press when it's almost like these wacky First Amendment issues or things where they're somewhat unpopular
Yeah.
positions that they're taking to try to vindicate the rights of someone. But I think the reason I mention this is it's important because there's been a lot of different lawsuits. But once again, I find that some of the most meaningful work in the trenches is actually being done by the ACLU on cases that are a very wide import. I mean, to me, you know, it's interesting when a lot of people are summing up from the first Trump administration what the biggest problems were in that administration. People often forgot about the kids who were separated from their parents. I didn't. And I thought that was really important work that the ACLU is doing. This is another case. There's been a lot of litigation against the administration, but I think this is a rather remarkable result. And I think it's worth, you know, we spent a lot of time on our podcast talking about alarms and concerns and this forth. This is, I'd say, a celebration really of the rule. We just had a lot of people celebrating on Law Day, the rule of law. This is an example of what the rule of law can look like.
Absolutely. And a product of what so far has been the one real bastion of hope we've seen from the Supreme Court in all of this, where they said, you know, by the way, you got to give notice to people who you're going to deport so that they can challenge it. And they did, you know, establish that it needed to be through a habeas. So you're seeing that play out now, which I think is, you know, the cases are kind of building on each other. And it seems a little bit like the courts. I mean, this judge obviously cites to that Supreme Court decision because he has to. But there seems to be they're all watching each other. And there's a little bit of, you know, okay, they can only go so far on this. This is our one area that we, the courts, really, you know, due process, like the role of courts, we're gonna cabin this a little bit. That's how it feels.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's interesting. Both of us are old enough to remember 9/11 and the legal, controversies that spun from that. And I think it felt like to me living through that era as a young lawyer at the time, that it took the courts a while to get to the spot where they were really taking a close look at how people who are deemed enemy combatants were viewed and so forth. You know, if I remember, for example, the Padilla case and so forth, it took a while for that wind its way through the courts. That is not happening here. I mean, we are seeing in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, we are seeing courts really out front on this issue. And I think it's partly that unlike the George W. Bush administration, which of course was reacting to an actual emergency, an actual incursion into the United States, this was sort of conjured by Trump too. And I think it's fair to say that they're not going about this in as sophisticated of a way or as careful of a way as the George W. Bush administration did.
Well, and they're going at it. Yeah. I mean, they're taking a sledgehammer to the institutions and the rule of law, and the pace is so much faster, right? Part of why, I mean, I know after 9/11, a lot of things absolutely did happen quickly as they needed to, but in part, you're right. I mean, there was this, you know, national shock, whether you were a judge or just, you know, a person on the street about what had happened. And so almost anything seemed okay for a while in terms of reaction. Here, even if you know, even acknowledging, as I do, and you probably do, I think, that there's issues with our border and immigration, and we need to deal with them as a country and a government in a more effective way. I don't, you know, these are not reasonable responses. And so I think there's more of a gap between the crisis, quote unquote, and what the administration is doing and how they're doing it. It seems almost even faster than in the, immediate post 9/11 world.
Yeah, and then doing it, you use the term sledgehammer, doing it in a way that's not, say, carefully vetted and crafted by lawyers, but rather seems to be hastily thrown together. And I think when that happens, it's easier for judges to quickly see through it and not credit and give the level of deference that they might otherwise give to the president and the executive branch.
Absolutely.
All right. So, Mimi, I think we're continuing good news. This is almost like good week of good news and this is crazy because Asha's not here. I think she would revel in the good news. Another piece of good news. Is it possible that the United States Senate is growing some cojones and presenting some potential pushback to President Trump?
So the short answer to that is yes. But as usual, it is a little more complicated. And by the way, I'm going to apologize to Asha for being here on the one day when we have two topics that are good news. But hopefully this means that, it won't be the only one and she'll get her chance too. So Ed Martin is up for U.S. Attorney he's the acting U.S. Attorney or interim. I actually don't remember which one. Interim. Okay, because there is a difference. Interim U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia and has been since the beginning. And so we already get to see how he's going to be. But he is also the nominee. Those two things don't always go hand in hand. In several districts, we had actings and interims that were not the nominee, but here Ed Martin is. And so not only do we have his background to look at, but we have actual conduct of how he's been acting since January 20th or right around there. And when I say that he is by far the most unqualified, dangerous, out of control, kind of so irrationally impulsive and he either doesn't realize how bad his conduct is or he doesn't care. And I kind of think it's the latter because that's how it seems. So that's why I say, reckless and impulsive and all that. And so he's up for nomination. What has started happening is the Democrats were pushing the Republicans to hold a hearing on his nomination. So instead of just, doing it on the papers and going to a vote, they would actually have him come and answer questions under oath, which doesn't even sound like such a big deal, but it actually would have been the first time in like 40 years, apparently, that a U.S. attorney nominee has actually had a hearing. And the Republicans, it seemed like were kind of saying, we're not going to do that because that could be really embarrassing for them, I think. And so, but then all of a sudden, I think yesterday, we got news that his nomination was on hold. And so that, and they had started getting the written answers from Martin, right? So not only do you have all the stuff that we should get into it a little bit more to explain to the listeners just how bad he is, but not only did you have all that stuff, but they started getting some of the written materials back, I think. And then all of a sudden we heard that it was on hold, which doesn't mean it's dead yet, but means there's some Republicans having some pause. And so, let me just explain if it's okay. It's impossible. We could spend an hour talking just about all the things about Ed Martin that are wrong. I mean, starting with, he has absolutely no experience as a prosecutor. He was involved personally in January 6th. He openly defends, the insurrection. He has fired people who were working in the office he is now leading, who handled the January 6th cases, because most of them came out of that office. And he just fired them, saying those cases, were political and bad. I say so, so you're fired. He has threatened Georgetown Law School openly in a letter. I mean, even assuming there were some merits to his claims about the DEI program that he was talking about, which first of all has nothing to do with the U.S. Attorney's Office and isn't sort of his, bailiwick or, area. But still, I mean, a U.S. attorney writing a letter openly to a subject or a target is just really out there. And he did that. He has openly talked about how he's one of the president's lawyers. He's there to protect him, which is totally the antithesis of what the DOJ and a U.S. attorney's job is, which is actually to serve the people and do justice and the Constitution. I mean, the list could go on and on. There's also his embrace of sort of well-known Nazis who he now is claiming, oh, I didn't know how bad they were, but actually there's evidence to contradict that. So I don't know, maybe you have some other examples, but those are the ones that are sticking out for me now.
Well, what's interesting and crazy here, in my view, is that the bar was very low for Ed Martin. I mean, you can literally be, Kash Patel and fly through the United States Senate right now if you're a Trump nominee. Somebody who also totally unqualified, right? I mean, has no FBI experience, no law enforcement experience whatsoever. All Ed Martin had to do was not screw up. And he managed to screw up, which is amazing because, I mean, Tom Tillis, who is a Republican, and on the Judiciary Committee is like, I'm inclined to vote against this guy. And if he does, that's it. That is literally the end for Ed Martin. And he screwed up. You gave a lot of reasons why. I mean, yes, he's unqualified, but that would not have sunk him. I mean, the fact that he's never been a prosecutor before would have been okay. A quote, breath of fresh air, perhaps, for these folks. The fact that he defended people from stop to steal may not have, and all that. The January 6th Thursday, that would have been perceived as okay as well. But I think what's amazing about Martin is his sheer, he has no filter.
Yep.
He has no judgment, sort of things that you would expect a prosecutor to have. And he's just firing off letters, like whatever his thoughts and musings are. And my favorite part of them, I'm just going to say personally, Mimi, is he fires off these letters. He fired off some of them within a day or two of taking the job, being like, they always start the same way. As U.S. attorney, I occasionally, see things on the internet and fire off letters like this. Is sort of things come to my attention and I respond to them. He says that all the time. And it's like, you have no idea first of all, that's not what U.S. attorneys do. And second of all, you just had the job for 2 days or 3 weeks or whatever the case may be. You haven't done any of this before. You're just sort of making stuff up. And he's just this freewheeling guy. There's a lot of times, there's a lot of middle-aged guys who just feel like they have too much bravado. They like a little too much confidence. And I think this guy is like exhibit A. Like if you're going to put an exhibit sticker on his forehead of like a guy who needs to like a little bit of self reflection.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're using different words to describe, impulsive and no filter and reckless. I mean, he threatens potential subjects and targets on social media. He threatened Jack Smith, the Save Your Receipts, to Covington and the law firm one of the law firms that, was given the executive order because Trump didn't like someone who had worked there, because in that case, they were defending Smith. So even assuming that these were legitimate investigations for the DC U.S. attorney to be opening, the fact that he goes out and threatens people with them and talks about them on social media, he's not even trying to act, I think, like a U.S. attorney, like the head of a DOJ office. And it seems like in some ways with this administration, it's definitely not about your qualifications or even your overall temperament, or, it's about your ideology in terms of loyalty to Trump and what you're willing to say about the 2020 election. But you do have to do a certain amount of at least going through the motions and saying the right thing and pretending a little bit, at least until you get confirmed. Pam Bondi did it in her hearings. Patel did it. And he's not even trying. And I do think this gets to one sort of little bit more nuanced issue about Ed Martin. And I don't know what's motivating the final hold. There was also this revelation just last week. ProPublica did this whole article about how Ed Martin was a defendant. It seemed like something with his family, some kind of lawsuit. And Martin was like orchestrating this kind of social media campaign against the judge and hiding it, pretending like he wasn't involved, like orchestrating it and disguising his involvement. So that's just, yet another thing that shows something is kind of off there. But the DOJ so far has been pretty shameless, and it's overall like sending lawyers into court who don't have full information. I mean, this is all around, like in the immigration context and beyond, and telling lawyers who go into court things that don't make sense or don't fit the facts. And judges are starting to challenge them on it and say, wait a minute, press them more in a way that is uncomfortable. And I think Ed Martin as U.S. attorney would take that to such a kind of extreme that it certainly should give senators, even of the Republican Party, pause about, should this guy be the U.S. attorney? Will a court ever believe anything that comes out of this office again? And I think the answer is very likely no. If he's the U.S. attorney, they're going to be pressing on every single thing, no matter who appointed that judge. And so, maybe that sunk in a little bit. I don't know, but it's certainly a consequence for them if he is somehow confirmed, that that's going to be really, really hard for them to get things through those courts.
So it's interesting, just to draw kind of a thread from our last segment, where we were talking about the other cases. I think Ed Martin is sort of another exhibit A for wildly ineffective at accomplishing anything. Part of, if he was confirmed, or certainly if we're just looking at his performance now, Ed Martin is great at firing off random letters saying bizarre things, you often filled with typos or factual misstatements, but none of that would ever turn into anything chargeable. I mean, as somebody who practices against the Justice Department as a defense attorney on a regular basis, there's no way that any of that is going to turn into something that's going to be indictable. Ultimately, he's just firing off his thoughts and missives on his own, prejudging the matter, potentially prejudicing people in the court of public opinion, when of course there's no due process whatsoever. They don't have an opportunity to contest those allegations or opportunity to be heard. He shows his bias. Times talking, I think I still remember when he tweeted about he's going to help anyone who goes after Elon Musk, that sort of thing. So I just think he's kind of a fool and an embarrassment and kind of a clown. And it's amazing to me that, there are people like Kash Patel managed to clear that bar, but this guy is like, it's like I said, such a low bar. This guy managed to act like such a fool that it's just, there's at least one Republican senator who doesn't seem like he could stomach this with a straight face. That's quite remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Low bar, and Ed Martin doesn't even come close to meeting that really low bar. In fact, he sort of just crumbles under it with his craziness. I mean, there's really no other way to describe it.
Right. He's interesting in a certain regard because he's so bizarre. And it's crazy, by the way, we've got through a whole segment talking about Ed Martin and did mention the time in which he got involved in a case that he was on the defense side for. He had a total conflict of interest. It's sort of like, it's like, right, if I got into government and the Justice Department, and I'm suddenly like intervening in my own clients, then former clients' cases, like on the other side with all the knowledge I have. It's very bizarre, problematic, to put it mildly. yeah, this guy is really something. I don't think anybody is going to be sad to see him go. And by the way, another conflict of interest, investigating your own. He's having his team at the District of Columbia investigate their own office for the cases that they brought. I mean, it's bizarre. It makes absolutely no sense.
And also, I mean, again, not that the Republicans or even the Democratic senators necessarily care about this, but you and I can think as former prosecutors, and I can think as a DA who headed an office about, where I was coming in and making some changes. I don't know how you lead that office. I mean, there will be such resistance to him. I mean, sure, there's fear, and so that may keep people in line for a while, but he's doing absolutely nothing to engender the loyalty is such a loaded word here, but the goodwill of the people who work for him. And not that that's the only thing that should motivate people working in a government office, but you have to kind of have some faith and trust and respect for your leader in an institution that big and like that. And I mean, that's just, no matter what political party they're from, I can't imagine that anyone in that office has that.
Yeah, anyone who listens to this podcast knows that we covered Ed Martin very early, the early days of Trump too, and
many moons ago,
many moons ago it seems, although it's only been 100 days since
yes.
Or whatever it's been since he took office. But there were people leaving, and very noisily leaving at that time. I have some idea of how people in the office feel about that. It's not positive. Yeah. So, but definitely positive news that a co-equal branch of government has decided that maybe they will do something about, the checks and balances that the framers of the Constitution intended for in this case, the United States Senate to exercise.
Yeah, I mean, because, you and I both, and every legal commentator and every person out there every day, are we in a constitutional crisis? And we're not answering that question here. But certainly one answer to that, to any question, is we are in a crisis where the executive branch is trying to amass power, and the legislative branch is doing absolutely nothing. So this would be an encouraging sign, as you say, not just because it would be the end of Ed Martin, though let's see what we get. Careful what you wish for, but it's hard to imagine anyone as bad as him or as dangerous, as reckless as him. But it would be a sign that there's a tiny little bit of life left in those checks and balances, as you say, which is right now just the most important thing. We're seeing it in the courts. I mean, we talked about it just in part one, and we've seen it, many, many times in the courts, but the courts cannot do it alone.
Well, very hopeful day on at least two fronts. So that's always a good thing.
And I apologize again to Asha, but we will have more.
So, Mimi, before we go, we were talking a little bit today about your mom. I will tell you, as we get older, I do think it's important to treasure the time we have with our parents. I don't know about you, but for me, I actually moved back to my hometown in large part because I want to be closer to my mom. I see her every Sunday and have brunch with her. It's I think one of the most important things as you get older. You want to spend as much time with your parents as possible.
I didn't know that you would move back for that reason. That's very nice. And yeah, I mean, I think it's that, and it's also appreciating, so my mom just turned 95.
Wow.
Which is, it's like pretty incredible. So she can't quite believe it herself. I do feel lucky, like maybe I have some good genes, but that means she was born in 1930. Okay. And
wow.
Yeah. And so when you think about the things she's seen and the history she's seen, and so what I wanted to tell you is I saw her yesterday briefly in Baltimore, and she said, "Oh yeah, you know, we've been doing this thing where we're protesting outside." She lives in a sort of, you know, senior community. So we've been protesting outside, holding signs up, and people go by and they honk. And I, as if I knew what she was talking about, I said, "What? You're doing what?" And you know, it's not the first time she's been involved in something like that, but I didn't realize she was doing it sort of on a regular basis, and with, you know, this group of people who she previously had told me kind of avoided talking about politics or just didn't come up much. So here they are, and they're doing this. And she said, "Yeah, I think my picture was taken or something." So I went looking for it, and I don't know if you can see, but that's my mom holding up two signs, and it's an article in the Baltimore Brew. And one of her signs, which I'm very proud of, I had nothing to do with this, says "Hands off our federal employees." So I particularly like that one because, you know, it's referring to DOJ and all the federal employees, civil servants that I think you and I both feel kind of a little protective of. It just, you know, this group of people in their 90s, my mom may or may not be the oldest one there, but even in their world where they have lived through McCarthyism and the Depression and World War I and World War II and the missile crisis, you know, things that my mom has told me about, you know, Trump stands out to them, and what they're doing now. They on their own just decided. I've never. She's been there for several years now. They've never gone out and protested anything. So I think that speaks a little bit, you know, not only to this group of people and maybe my mom, but you know, what the period of history we're seeing.
That's amazing, by the way. And that's also, this is sort of a great fitting topic for good news, for this good news week.
Right.
That's great. My mom is younger, 78. But definitely we don't talk politics because I'm pretty sure she voted for Trump. Most of my family did.
All right.
But I think, you know, no matter what, it's great to love our parents, and kudos to you for
Yes.
having a mom at that age who is able to be out there vigorously protesting. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it looks like she let go of her walker there, so I might have to scold her for that.
That's awesome.